Hi, welcome back to Fastball Profits. My name is Rob Scooter. Thanks for joining me tonight. Tonight I'm going to do the start-sit video for Week 10. Just give you some bits of information, food for thought as you consider who should start and who should sit this week. Now, before we get into it, one thing we want to remind people is really try to give you solid information, whether it's on the videos or whether it's at the bottom of the videos when you ask us specific questions to your league and team. We try to stick to information, statistics, trends, numbers, player and team information, and news, and we really try to stay away from hunches or feelings. We think that if you play the stats, if you play the numbers, if you stick to solid information, 9 out of 10 times you're going to win. And I'll give you an example this week. Now, we advise a number of you that if you had J, that if you had other options out there, I know some of you didn't have options and you had to play him. If you did, it worked out well for you. But if you had options, we suggest you should sit him. And here's why. One, he was playing Denver, who was number 1 against the run. They're very stout. Going into last week, they were averaging something like 77 yards allowed per game in rush. It was just phenomenal. Now, you also add in the fact that he was just traded from Miami to Philadelphia. And the coach had said he was trying to learn something around 10 to 15 plays, and he would have limited carries, limited involvement in the offense if he was activated. And then the final thing is Jay's played decent this year, but nothing like he did last year. So those three things going into Denver against a great run defense, limited carries, limited playbook knowledge, and not having a phenomenal year per se, everything pointed to the fact that you should sit him. And then you even add on top of that, it's not like Philadelphia was desperate for running backs. They had running backs. They had Smallwood, Clement, and LeGarrette Blount had been playing well. So all those things kind of made us feel like, you know what, you probably want to sit the guy this week. Well, he had a good day. He had 8 carries, 77 yards, and a TD. So would I advise differently? Well, I'll tell you what, if that scenario came up again, I would still advise you to sit him. Why? Because I'm giving you solid information. I'm not going to get into hunches and feelings. And every once in a while, you're going to play a solid play, and there'll be an anomaly out there. But I think what can happen is you can get caught up in hunches, you can get caught up in feelings, you can roll the dice, and it may work out for you from time to time. And I think what can tend to happen in fantasy football when you roll the dice and play hunches and not the numbers, you remember when you rolled the dice and worked out well for you, and it's easy to forget the times that you came up empty on a hunch that you played. And it reminds me a lot of addicts. I know a lot of addicts, when they go to the casino, they come back, they will often remember the wins they had, but they rarely forget how many times that they lost. Once again, when it comes to gambling, the house always wins. When it comes to fantasy football, playing the statistics, playing the information, in the end always wins. Stick to good numbers, stick to solid advice, stay away from your feelings, stay away from your hunches, things like that. Another thing we want to remind you guys, when I give you this information, you have to contextualize it for your league. What I mean by that is I don't know your scoring system, your bench depth, the waiver wire, things like that. So many factors, there's so many variables that I don't know. So you have to contextualize this for your league. If you have specific questions, put it at the bottom of the video. We'd love to answer it the best that we can in a timely manner. And this is the other thing that we want you to consider too, is we may answer something on Wednesday, and then by Friday, there might be a piece of information, injury, something that can change that. Last weekend, Deshaun Watson went down. And that changed a lot, obviously. A lot of the start-sit advice that we gave you changed based on that, not just for him, but of course, Fuller, Hopkins, other guys. So take this, contextualize it for you. Let's get into the first game this week. Cardinals versus the Seahawks. Look at the quarterbacks. Russell Wilson, well, he's a must start. He plays Arizona, allows the 9th most points to quarterbacks. And that actually would be even worse if you consider the fact that Cardinals actually haven't played a lot of good quarterbacks at this point. And if you look at Russell Wilson right now at this point, if you look at average points scored by quarterbacks weekly, he's number 2, only behind Deshaun Watson. So he's had a phenomenal year. He's a guy that you got to start. Seattle has no running game at all. Start Russell Wilson. What about Drew Stanton? Well, he had a respectable game 1, but it was against San Francisco, who was horrible against the pass. He ended up with 201 yards passing, 2 touchdowns to 1 interception. But he's playing Seattle. And Seattle's defense gives up the 9th fewest points to quarterbacks. So concerning Drew, I'd sit him at this point unless you have nobody else out there. And if you're really desperate, you could play him. Once again, start Wilson. I would sit Drew Stanton. Let's look at some running backs out there involved in this game. What about Adrian Peterson? Well, 3 games now he's played for Arizona. 2 of the 3 he's been over 100 yards. Last game he had I think 157 yards, had a great game there. Well, now he plays Seattle, who gives up the 5th fewest points to running backs. So this is not a great matchup for Adrian. Now, I would imagine what's going to happen is if I'm Seattle and I'm playing Arizona, I'm going to load the box, try to shut down Adrian, and force Drew Stanton to beat me throwing the ball. So should you start Adrian? Well, I still think you have to start Adrian Peterson. Here's why. Simply by volume. It's really hard out there. People are scrambling to find a good running back 2, and that's what he qualifies for this week. Adrian's a running back 2. He's the bell call. He's probably going to get the ball 15 to 20 times at least. He's going to become a go-to guy. I would imagine Arizona try to counter some of the pressure that Seattle is going to bring. He's going to try to run the ball. They don't want to get into a shootout. So all those make Adrian running 2 this week. I would start him. As far as Lacey and Rawls go, well, Lacey's expected to miss the game with the groin injury, and that leaves Rawls. Now, because of this injury to Lacey, it kind of puts Rawls back on the radar for us as fantasy owners. He looked decent last game. He had 9 carries, 34 yards, 2 catches for 31 yards. And going into this game, a Thursday night game, he won't have to split carries with Lacey, and that actually puts Rawls on the radar as a viable option. Now, he's not great, but you have to not forget that was just a couple years ago. He's a couple years removed from 830 yards and a 5.6 yards per carry in 13 games. So this is a guy that's got some potential there. So he's not just a bust. He's not just a bum. He's a guy that has proven he can be. Now, he has struggled last year, struggled a little bit this year. Last game, he did better. He's going to get bulk carries. So if you're really desperate out there and you're struggling on the waiver wire to pick somebody up, he's a guy you could take some shots with. Now, the downside for Rawls, he plays Arizona, who gives up the 10th fewest points to running back. So when I look at Rawls, he's a guy you could start, but see him as a running back 3 or 4 at this point, closer to a running back 3. What about the wideouts in this game? Well, Larry Fitzgerald, last game he fared well with Drew at quarterback. He had 5 catches, 70 yards, and 9 targets. But he plays against San Francisco, a defense that allows a lot of passing yards. Well, can you start Larry? Should you sit Larry? Well, I would say you probably need to start him. One, he's too good. He's the featured guy in that offense in terms of wideouts go and targets. You need to temper your expectations. Once again, he's going to face Seattle and Sherman. So going into this week, I think you got to start Larry, but I would see him as a wide receiver 2. You got to bump down the expectation. As far as the other wide receivers there, you look at John Brown, J.J. Nelson, Jerron Nelson, all those guys. I'm sorry, Jerron Brown. All 3 of those guys, they're just not dependable. Last week, John Brown had a catch. J.J. Nelson had 1 catch, and Jerron Nelson had 1 catch. They spread them around too much. In fact, those wideouts, they've had a total of 6 catches the last 5 weeks. You can't trust any of them. I would stay away with them, especially with Drew at quarterback. They're just not dependable. So I would start Larry, and I would sit the other guys. As far as Seattle there, Doug Baldwin had a good game. You got to start Doug Baldwin. He's their number 1 guy there. He was quiet for a couple weeks. Blew up last week. Did decent. And the other guys are a decent option. If you look at Lockett and Richardson. Now, they're a little quiet last week, but they're getting volume once again. They can't run the ball. And so I would see those guys as decent options against Arizona. They would fall into what I would say your wide receiver 3 or 4 category. You can start them. Tight ends in this game. Jimmy Graham. Arizona gives up the 16 most points to tight ends. He's questionable, but sounds to me what's happening right now. He missed practice earlier this week. They're just managing his reps, trying to keep him fresh for the game. So everything would point to Jimmy Graham starting. And if he does play in that game, you need to play him. Another one out there is I would really sit all the Cardinals tight ends. None of them really have a lot of value. As far as kickers go, Blair Walsh would normally be a good start. Last week, he missed 3 field goals that essentially cost him the game. Now, this is kind of how the tires came off, or the wheels came off for him in Minnesota. He started missing some kicks. It got in his head. He began to struggle. So if I had Walsh out there, it would be a good week. Everything would indicate that he would be a good start. But I have to admit, I'd be a little bit leery right now if I was a Walsh owner. As far as Phil Dawson at kicker, with Drew at quarterback against Seattle, I would stay away. I'd find a better option at kicker. As far as defenses go, start the Cardinals. Start Seattle. The Cardinals give up the 8th most points to defenses, and I would sit the Cards. If you look at the Cardinals defense, besides when they played San Francisco and Indy, they haven't produced. They're purely a matchup play at this point. So once again, defenses, start Seattle, sit the Cardinals. The Saints versus the Bills. Well, look at Drew Brees. Faces Buffalo Bills, who give the 5th fewest points to quarterbacks. And he's really still a good option at this point. Hall of Fame quarterback. Now, he's not a quarterback of old. If you look at the Saints right now, they're on a great winning streak, and they're winning games by running the ball and playing defense. So you got to lower sit on Drew Brees. This is not the Drew Brees of before, where he's got to throw for 350 yards, have 3 TDs just to keep him in the game. You look at a game like this, I still think he's a guy that you need to start, but you have to look at maybe 225 yards, 2 TDs, and 1 interception is kind of the line that you might get from him. Now look at Tyrod Taylor. He's playing New Orleans. Now, New Orleans gives up the 13th fewest points to quarterbacks, and the defense has played much better lately. But if you take a look at how they've kind of bolstered their numbers, they've kind of padded their stats. If you look at the quarterbacks they did against Fitzpatrick, Trubinsky, Hundley, and Cutler. Now, if you take a look at some of the other quarterbacks they faced, when they faced Sam Bradford, Matthew Stafford, and Brady, they got lit up. And so New Orleans defense is making improvements, but they haven't played a lot of good quarterbacks. Now, I'm not going to say Tyrod Taylor's a great quarterback, but I think he's better than Trubinsky, and I think he's better than Hundley and Cutler. So I think he's a guy that you can look at starting. Now you add on Benjamin to that lineup, and you merge Zay Jones, and he's getting Clay back this week. Tight end Clay sounds like he should be back. All those things would say that Tyrod is worth a look if you need somebody for a bye week replacement, or if you had an injury, or if you're in a league that plays 2 quarterbacks. He's a guy that would be a decent option there. What about running backs in this game? Well, look at McCoy. Last week, McCoy laid an egg for a lot of teams. I know it's disappointing, but it doesn't matter. He's still running back 1. Even with a bad week, he's a guy that you need to start. He plays New Orleans, who'll give up the 14th most points to running backs. And then you look at Kamara and you look at Ingram, and both of those are running backs for New Orleans that you have to start. Now, many sites, if you look at a lot of sites out there rank fantasy football, they actually have Kamara and Ingram both in the top 10 in this game, which is kind of remarkable if you think about that. And I think if you look at the Saints offense has been able to support statistically in fantasy football both running backs. They're both staying relative. They're both producing. And if you look at Kamara right now, he's really a stud. He's a star in the making. In fact, I think he's very close to overtaking Ingram as the lead guy in that offense. He's been lights out. As far as wideouts go, look at Michael Thompson. Now, for a lot of you, Michael Thompson has been a disappointment. Only 2 TDs on the year. He's not ever reached over 100 yards. I thought last game he was going to do that. He didn't do that. But he still has 50 catches on the year at this point, which is really good. He's on pace for around 100 catches. He's averaging over 70 yards per game. Now, the Bills are typically good against wideouts, so you got to take Thomas. You got to bump him down to kind of wide receiver 2 this week. But it would be wrong to sit the guy. Even though he's disappointed, many of you took him early. Some of you took him in the first round. And if you did, I'm sure you're extremely disappointed. But he's not a guy that you want to sit at this point. He's a wide receiver 2. Look at Ted Ginn Jr. Now, Ted Ginn Jr. is the number 2 wideout on that team. Snead has disappeared. I don't know what happened. A lot of people were big on this year. He was suspended. He came out of it. He had injury, but I don't know what's gone on. This guy has disappeared. He's not relevant at all. Now, you look at Ted Ginn Jr. Now, Bills give the 16th most points to wideouts. And they're running more now. Because they're running the ball more, it makes a guy like Ted Ginn Jr. lower ceiling. He comes in as about a wide receiver 4 at this point. Now let's take a look at the Buffalo wide receivers. Anybody there has value? Well, Benjamin, he didn't play last week, and the reason why he didn't, he got traded on Tuesday, game was on Thursday. He just didn't have enough time to learn the playbook, learn the system, and so he sat. Now, he'll be obviously the number 1 wideout for the Bills there. Now, is he going to be thrive? Is his career going to take up? What is he going to do? Well, a lot of people are excited about this trade. I'm somewhere in the middle. I don't think it's a bad trade for him. I don't think it's going to hurt him. I don't think it's going to help him per se. Let's ask this question for some of you out there that are really excited on Travis Benjamin. When's the last Buffalo wideout to thrive? It's been a long time since they've had one that thrived. Now, it's either system or maybe talent. Now, maybe he's got enough talent that he thrives. But here's what I think is going to happen there. I see Benjamin's numbers being very similar to what they were in Carolina. I see not a whole lot of change in that. You look at both Cam and you look at Tyrod Taylor, both can move their feet, both can run. Their similarities in how they play quarterback. And so I think that a guy like Benjamin's going to have about the same statistics, same numbers. But he does become the number 1 guy there. So you take a look at this week playing New Orleans. I see him as a wide receiver 2 or 3, closer to a wide receiver 3, just because it's his first time actually playing in a game with Tyrod Taylor. We'll see how comfortable they get. They see whether or not they've got any timing. You look at Zay Jones, he's questionable with knee. He's looking better and better. Zay Jones is not somebody you're going to start right now, but he's certainly somebody in dynasty leagues you want to keep your eye on. Then you look at Thompson on that. He had a good game last week, and he's actually done decent recently. He's a guy that was signed off Chicago's team, Chicago Bears of all things. It's hard to believe that they gave him up. You look at the fact that they need wideouts. But his statistics were in garbage time. Stay away from him. And the other one is Jordan Matthews. Now, last week, Jordan Matthews had his best game with 6 catches, 64 yards. He's a decent wideout, but he's not a wide receiver 1. And I actually think he's going to improve now that he doesn't have to become the number 1 guy, and Benjamin will become the number 1 guy. I think you can see Jordan Matthews' numbers pick up a little bit. He's kind of a number 2 guy. But for him right now, I would just kind of wait and see how this plays out. As far as tight ends go, New Orleans is tough against tight ends. They allow the 5th fewest to tight ends. And so you take a look at Clay, who's due back. He looked good before the injury. He's questionable. He didn't practice on Monday. Now, another question mark as far as Clay. One, he's playing New Orleans, which is good against tight ends. But the emerging O'Leary, I think, is going to steal some targets from Clay at this point. And so all those things make Clay or O'Leary kind of a risky pick. You can see how it plays out. Probably the best thing that could happen at this point, if you're looking at starting a tight end in this game, is actually have Clay miss one more game. At least you could roll with O'Leary and feel safe. Clay comes back, he might be a little more talented than O'Leary to steal some targets, but there's just so many question marks for tight ends. I would stay away from both of those. And as far as tight ends go, for New Orleans, Kobe Fleener has got 7 catches last 6 games. Ouch. Bears are a little vulnerable, not the Bears. The Bills are vulnerable against tight ends. They give a decent amount of points to tight ends. But you take a look at how terrible Fleener has been lately and the fact they're riding the ball, I would just stay away from him. As far as kickers go, Steven, Buffalo Bills kicker, had a decent start, but he had a 5-game stretch there where he was averaging over 15 points a game, and so I'd be comfortable starting him in this game, and then Lutz is an okay start. The one thing you need to consider with both of these kickers, it's in Buffalo, so the weather could be an issue. Kind of watch that and see how that looks. As far as defense go, New Orleans is a very low-end start this week against them. Now, if you take a look at you look at Tyrod Taylor, the Jets and the Bengals got to him in terms of putting pressure on last week. The Jets had like 7 sacks. But if you take away those two games, the Jets and the Bengals, teams have had a hard time putting pressure on Tyrod Taylor. In fact, the Bills allowed the 10th fewest points to defenses. So you could start New Orleans, but they're very low-end start this week. I would sit the Bills. Drew Brees is even harder to get to. They run the ball so much. In fact, New Orleans has given up the seventh. They've only the 7th fewest points to defenses. In fact, New Orleans has only allowed a sack per game this year. Let me say that again, kind of fumbling over my words there. But New Orleans gives up the 7th fewest points to defenses, and they're only allowing a sack per game. And so I would sit the Bills defense. But the Packers versus the Bears, well, Mitch Trubisky, you need to sit him. Don't even consider him. He hasn't thrown a TD in 3 games. He's averaging approximately 125 yards passing per game, and he's a rookie mess at this point. Stay away from him. Brent Hundley, he played better last Monday night, but he's not good, and he's playing Chicago that gives up the 4th fewest points to quarterbacks. So I would stay away from both of these guys. I wouldn't even think about starting them. Let's look at running backs. You need to start Jordan Howard. This guy's a stud running back. He plays Green Bay, a defense that gives up the 7th most points to running backs. Even with teams stacking the box to shut Jordan down, he's still been able to break the 100-yard barrier 3 times this year, and he's got 5 touchdowns on the year. So Jordan Howard is a guy that you need to start in all leagues. Some of you may be wondering if it's a good start for Tariq Cohen. Well, I would sit him until he rebounds. Now, he's capable of having a big game from time to time with his speed. Now, his value is in the passing game, but if you look at the last 4 games, he's only had 1 catch per game. Stay away from him. I know there's a lot of early season hype. I know he's fun to watch, but the bottom line, he's just not producing. With Mitch Trubisky at quarterback, I would stay away from him. Now, what about the running back situation for Green Bay? Look at Ty Montgomery, Aaron Jones. Are those guys that you could start? Well, Aaron Jones was shut down by Detroit last night. And if you watch the game, they really crowded the line. They really forced Hundley to beat them, and he had a hard time with that. Until he can do it consistently, I think a lot of defenses, when they play Green Bay, that's what they're going to do. They're going to crowd the line, they're going to stack the box, try to shut down the run, and make Hundley beat them. So that really takes away from Aaron Jones' value, and I think he's a great running back. I think next year he's going to be phenomenal with Aaron Rodgers back at quarterback. But moving forward, he takes a huge hit. He's not the only one. When Aaron Rodgers went down, the entire offense took a hit. If you're somebody who had Adams, Cobb, or Nelson, all their stock took a nosedive when Aaron Rodgers left. And so what do you do at this point? I feel bad. Obviously, you drafted these guys. They're doing great. Aaron Rodgers goes out for the year. Suddenly your fantasy season looks dismal. I would say Aaron Jones has got kind of running back 3 appeal this week. Now, Ty Montgomery, another running back there. He fared a little bit better Monday night's game. Now, if you look at it, he was more effective running the ball. I think he had 3 carries for 33 yards, and I think he had 1 catch for 18 yards. But a lot of his rushes were plays where they're draw plays or running plays with lines and pass protection. So don't let that fool you. Don't get too excited. I don't think he's going to overtake Aaron Jones as a running back at this point. But moving forward, I think that Ty Montgomery will have a role in this offense. One reason why is because I think the Packers will be playing from behind a lot, and they're going to need to throw the ball. And, of course, Ty Montgomery, a converted wide receiver, can do that. And I think that he's going to have kind of a running back 3 in PPR leagues. And what I would do is I just kind of watch and see how this kind of plays itself out in terms of his role. As far as wideouts go, what do you do? Well, you got to sit all Bears with wideouts. Now, Inman got traded there, and I think eventually he could have some value down the road. But right now, you just got to sit all wideouts for Chicago. Mitch is a mess. And the other thing is Inman once again may have some long-term value there, but until him and Mitch get on the same page, until they play together and Trubisky improves, I would sit all Bears wideouts. Now, as Green Bay wideouts are concerned, the Bears allow the 12th fewest points to wideouts. They're strong against wideouts also. They're a pretty good defense. As bad as the Bears are this year, the one thing they're doing, they're playing good defense. You look at last game, Nelson had 7 targets, Adams had 10 targets, Cobb had 5. They played decent, but it was against Detroit, who's vulnerable to wide receivers, and the Bears are much tougher to wideouts in this game. I look at Nelson. He's still the number 1 guy in that. He's still very talented. So going into this matchup, I would say he's a wide receiver 3. You look at Adams as a wide receiver 4, and Cobb, if you're really, really desperate, is kind of a wide receiver 5 this week. As far as tight ends go, Chicago has nobody to start. Miller's out for the year. Bennett has been very good all year. He missed because of an injury. I would stay away from him. As far as kickers go, Crosby's averaging about 5 points per game. I would sit him. And Barth is averaging about 7.25 points the last 3 games. He would be an okay start. If you have to pick a kicker in this game, I would go with Barth. As far as defenses go, actually both defenses are worth a start in this game. If you want to play either one of these defenses, could have a big game. How about the Lions versus the Browns? Well, let's look at quarterbacks. It doesn't matter who they start. You need to sit all Cleveland quarterbacks. Kaiser faces a tough Detroit defense against quarterbacks. So sit all Cleveland quarterbacks. Don't even consider it. You look at Matthew Stafford. Now he's playing the Browns, who give the 10th most points to quarterbacks, and right now Matthew Stafford is playing very well. You look at Tate's shoulder is fine. This is a great matchup for Matthew Stafford. You need to start him. You should have a good week. As far as running backs go, you look at Amir Abdullah. Now he scored a TD against Green Bay, but if you look at his yards per carry the last 2 games, they were 2.1 yards per carry, 2.3 yards per carry, and right now he has a career low 3.4 yards per carry. He hasn't run well. He's had 1 or 2 good games. He's really struggling. If you look at the Bears, things that make matters worse for Amir at this point is the Bears actually allow the 7th fewest points to running back. So I would sit Amir at this point unless you have no other option. He's not a guy that you want to play. Look at Riddick. Theo Riddick, does he have value? Well, I'd probably sit him too. He has PPR value, but he's been used less and less this year because what's happened is Tate and Jones are healthier and the offense is clicking with their wideouts and not throwing as much to the running backs as they once were. Now let's look at Isaiah Crowell. Going to this matchup, I actually would start Isaiah Crowell. Detroit gives up the 9th most points to running backs. In last game, he looked good against a strong Vikings defense. He had 11 carries for 64 yards and a TD. And the thing that really has been, I think, impactful for me is he's getting more involved in the passing game. In fact, he's had 8 catches the last 2 games. So Isaiah Crowell is a guy that I would start in this game. In fact, I would think that if I was the Browns, I'm going to want to take pressure off my quarterbacks. One of the ways I'm going to do that is I'm going to try to feed my running back a lot if I can. Hopefully they don't fall too far behind early on and make that irrelevant and have to abandon the run. But that's what I would do. I'll look at Duke Johnson. Well, Duke Johnson has moderate PPR value. Now, the thing that's been hurting Duke Johnson, he's been great early in the year. He's had a ton of catches. But the emergence of Crowell in the passing game has kind of hurt Duke. But I would imagine what's going to happen in this game is Cleveland's going to be playing from behind. They're going to have to throw the ball, and that's going to keep him involved. So Duke Johnson has value in PPR leagues. What about some other guys out there? What about wideouts? What about Bears wideouts? Well, let's take a look. First of all, the Browns give up the 8th fewest points to wideouts. And so the Browns are actually pretty decent against wideouts. But if you take a look a little bit deeper at that stat, once again, they've shut down a lot of wideouts. But some of the teams that they've had to throw to haven't been that great. If you look at the good wideouts that have played the Browns this year, when they face good quality wideouts, they've been exposed. And you look at Jones and Tate lately, they're actually playing at a high level. So I would start both Jones and Tate in this game. You look at Tate, he's had 7 catches, average 7 catches the last 3 games, and over 95 yards receiving the last 3 games. And Jones has been on fire the last 3 games, 36 targets, 3 TDs, averaging 110 yards. So Jones and Tate, I would start. Even though Cleveland, on paper, look like they can shut down wideouts, I think that's been against below average wideouts. When quality wideouts have faced them, they've exposed them. As far as Cleveland wideouts, you need to just sit them all. Don't start anybody there for Cleveland. As far as tight ends go, Detroit's tough against tight ends. They allow 9th fewest points, so I would sit David Njoku. Now, Eric Ebron looked better last game, but he's actually been benched a lot more for other tight ends that are more effective in the blocking scheme. So I would, I really at this point, I probably wouldn't start Eric Ebron, although the Bears do give the most points to tight end. So if you want to take a flyer, if you want to take a shot in very, very deep leagues, you can start Eric Ebron. As far as kickers go, I would start Prater. I'd sit Zane Gonzalez. As far as defenses, start Detroit, sit the Browns in this game. What about the Bengals and the Titans? What about this game here? Look at quarterbacks. Well, Marcus Mariota plays the Bengals, who give up the 6th fewest points to quarterbacks. Right now, Marcus is not playing at a real high level. In fact, he's only got 6 TD passes in 7 games. Now, he does get Corey Davis back, who's back last week, and that's going to help. But right now, there's nothing that would tell me, there's nothing that would seem to suggest there's going to be a quick turnaround in terms as far as Marcus Mariota goes at this point. So I would sit him and look elsewhere. Now, the guy out there is Andy Dalton. What about Andy Dalton? Well, he plays the Titans, who give the 14th most points to quarterbacks. Now, there's a 5-game stretch where Andy Dalton had 11 TD passes to 4 interceptions, looked pretty good. Now, the problem is the other 3 games, he had 0 TD passes to 4 picks, so he's kind of been one extreme or the other. And so when you look at Andy Dalton, if you need to start, he's not a bad start. He's not a great start this week. I think he's middle of the road. He kind of falls in that quarterback about 12 to 14 range. As far as running backs go, Mixon. Mixon plays the Titans. The Titans give the 15 most points to running backs. And right now, they are just struggling to run the ball. It's not just Mixon. When Hill was there, they just cannot run the ball at all. Mixon has carried himself. He had a touchdown last game, which salvaged his day. And he's got some PPR value. He's actually catching the ball in the backfield, which is helping. But you really look at, he's really kind of just struggling to run the ball. And he falls into what I would say is kind of a running back 3 conversation. He is a starting back. He is going to get the carries. He's got a decent matchup. But overall, he has struggled to run the ball this year. His yards per carry sits somewhere. I think it's like 2.5 yards per carry. It's really bad. So if you're really desperate, You could start mixing in that game. As far as other Cincinnati backs, I would sit Hill and Bernard. Now, what about Murray and Henry, running backs for the Titans? Should you start them? Well, the Bengals give up the 15th fewest points to running backs. Right now, you take a look at Murray. He's dealing with and playing through a knee injury. So what you need to do is watch the injury report on Friday, see how he's doing. He's pretty banged up. He's trying to fight through it. Now, you look at Henry. Henry has actually had a touchdown 2 of the last 3 weeks. And so what's happening between the injuries, the fact they're splitting carries, neither of them hold a lot of value at this point. If I had to lean one direction or the other, I'd probably lean towards the younger, healthier Henry. He holds, I would call, running back 3 value. Now, unless Murray sits, now if DeMarco Murray sits, and Henry moves into the running back 2 status. So that's something for you to consider. As far as wideouts go, A.J. Green, you need to start him every week. Last week, I know you heard a lot of you owners got kicked out in the first half. He got into a fight with Ramsey. But he should rebound this week against the Tennessee defense that allows 11th most points to wild. So I say A.J. Green's going to rebound. Brandon LaFell is not a real good option. His best yardage total for the year is 44 yards. So besides A.J. Green, I wouldn't consider any other wide receivers for Cincinnati. What about Titans wide receivers? We have Shard Matthews. Last week he had 70 yards and a TD. I would say he's not a great start for me. I see him as a wide receiver 3 in the right matchup, and this week is not that right matchup. I would say to him this week. I think what's going to happen is you look at Corey Davis. Corey Davis is eventually going to overtake him. Corey Davis is first-round pick, 5th overall. He's by far the most talented wide receiver, and so I think Rashard Matthews eventually is going to move into that number 2 role, and Corey Davis will become your number 1 guy. But they're playing the Bengals, and the Bengals give the 5th fewest points to wideouts. That's a really tough matchup for all those guys, so I'd probably sit Corey Davis, Decker. It's kind of what I would do at this point. As far as tight ends go, I would start Delaney Walker. He's a must-start. And Tyler Kroft is actually a good start. He's playing pretty good, and he's filling in real nicely for Tyler Eifert. Tennessee gives up the 14th most points to tight end, so you could start Tyler Kroft in that game. As far as kickers go, Suckup is a great start. Cincinnati gives up the 4th most points to kickers. I would sit Cohen, the kicker for Cincinnati. As far as defenses go, I would sit the Titans defense. They've had one decent game against the Browns. And Cincinnati does give up a lot of points to D, but that stat's been kind of penny. If you look at Cincinnati, they give up a lot of points to defenses, but they've also played defense like Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and Jacksonville, which the Titans are not. So I would sit them. Now, the Bengals defense is a middle-of-the-road play. Tennessee allows 15th fewest points to defenses. So if you want to play somebody, you could play Cincinnati. It's not a great start, but it's a decent start. What about the Steelers versus the Colts? Well, as far as quarterback play goes, you start Ben Roethlisberger, and he gives up the 8th most points to quarterbacks. Now, if you take away that 1 week that Ben Roethlisberger threw 5 interceptions, he's actually been good. In fact, in those other games, he's had 10 touchdown passes to only 4 picks, so he's been decent. And now the emergence of Juju Smith-Schuster can only help take pressure off him. He's got good weapons there. You look at, in fact, if you look at Ben Roethlisberger, if you look at 5 of the next 7 games, they're very passer-friendly. He's got a good schedule in the playoff. If you look at weeks 14, 15, and 16, Ben Roethlisberger's got a great schedule there. He's got Bell, great pass-catching back. He's got Brown, and now Juju. These are great guys there. Now, what about Jacoby Brissett? He's actually getting better. If you look at this year, he scored double-digit points every game except for week 1. But he's playing the Steelers, who give the 3rd fewest points to quarterbacks. So I think it's going to be a tough week for Jacoby Brissett. I would advise against starting him. I think he's a guy that you need to sit this week against Pittsburgh. As far as running backs go, you don't need me to tell you to start Le'Veon Bell. In fact, if you need me to tell you that, you probably shouldn't be playing fantasy football. He's a guy, what we call matchup proof. You start him every week. It doesn't matter who he plays. Now, he's playing Indianapolis, who give the 5th most points to running backs. This is a great start for him. I hope he blows up, has a huge week. What about Frank Gore? Now, Frank Gore plays Pittsburgh, who gives up the 12th most points to running backs. You look at Frank Gore, here's what you can kind of anticipate with this guy. He's 34 years old. I love him, but he's at the very end of his career. He's not explosive anymore, but he's reliable. He's a guy that you can trust for about 12 to 15 carries, maybe 16, 70 yards at the most. But he's really TD dependent, so he falls in that kind of running back 2 or 3 category. Now, Marlon Mack is there. Marlon Mack is a guy who's at times shown explosiveness. He's got good hands. He holds some PPR value, but very, very low-end PPR value. He's just not seeing the field enough to really warrant a play. Wideouts in this game go Antonio Brown and Juju Smith-Schuster are both great plays. Indianapolis gives up the 7th most points to wideouts. Now, T.Y. Hilton, what do you do with him? Now, I have T.Y. I played him last week. Thank God I played him. He had a huge week. But the other 3 weeks, he was brutal. Now he plays Pittsburgh, who gives up the 2nd fewest points to wideouts. So according to those numbers, you should probably sit T.Y. Hilton this week. But I would still say, even though he has a tough matchup and he has struggled this year, he's got too much potential and he's too talented to sit. So for me, he falls into what I would call the wide receiver 2. He is a feast or famine guy. But when he has blown up this year, he's the type of wide receiver that can have that game, that can carry your team. His other games he was quiet, but he's had 3 games this year where he's averaged 168 yards per game, so he can be phenomenal. He's one of these guys that has a bad matchup, but if you sit him, you could be shooting yourself because all of a sudden he'll go off for 7 catches, 150 yards, and 2 TDs. So I'm just not one to take that chance. So for me, he falls into that wide receiver 2 category. I also think in this game, too, that Indy will be playing from behind, which will force him to have to throw the ball downfield. I would sit all other Indianapolis wideouts in this game. As far as tight ends go, Brissett loves and Indy loves to use their tight ends. You got to start Jack Doyle. Pittsburgh is tough against tight ends, but he's averaging, if you look at Doyle, he's averaging 18.98 points the last 4 games in PPR league. So Jack Doyle has been huge. They keep going to him. As far as kickers go, I would start Boswell. I would sit Adam Vinatieri. As far as defenses go, start Pittsburgh. They should have a big game, and I would sit Indianapolis. Look at the Jets versus the Bucks. You look at Josh McCown. Tampa Bay gives up the 6th most points to quarterbacks, so I'll go for it. He's looking better and better. He's played very well lately. In fact, in the last 4 games, he's had 10 touchdown passes to 4 picks. You got Robbie Anderson, who's getting better and better, and their pass-catching backs, Forte and Paul, are both healthy, and the emergence of Austin Seferian-Jenkins at tight end give him some weapons around him. He's got a good start this weekend. They're playing Tampa Bay, who actually gives up a lot of points, the 8th most points, I think it is, to quarterbacks. Now, what about Ryan Fitzpatrick starting? Well, they shut down Winston for a few games because of shoulder issues he had. Now he's playing the Jets. Jets give the 5th most points to quarterbacks. But most likely, Ryan Fitzpatrick will be without Mike Evans, who was suspended for a cheap hit last game. And so now you're taking a backup quarterback. Yes, he's got a good matchup, but his number 1 wideout is out. So I think he's kind of a low-end, high-risk start. If you're really desperate, you can start him, but I prefer to look elsewhere if I was you. Now, as far as running backs in this game, now Martin struggled last week. Now he's playing the Jets to give the 16 most points to backs. He should rebound, so I think that Doug Martin's a good start. And I think what's going to probably happen also in this game is Tampa Bay is going to want to feed the running backs, take pressure off of Ryan, especially without Evans in that game, and so I would go with Doug Martin. And Tampa Bay gives up the 2nd most points to running backs, so that makes Forte and Paul both plays this week. And look at those 2 running backs, and I would probably be willing to play both of them. The guy that I would prefer to play if I had to choose between the 2 is Forte. I think he's the better of the 2 backs at this point. As far as wideouts go, Tampa Bay gives up the 2nd most points to wideouts. So look at Robbie Anderson, the guy that I would start last week. We highlighted him as a guy that we felt is trending upward, and sure enough, last week he caught another touchdown. That's 3 weeks in a row. He's a guy that you want to start. I would sit Curse. Here's why I would sit Curse in this game. Simply a lack of consistent targets and a role. He's had 5 catches total in the last 3 weeks. If you'd like to look at the way they spread that out, they use their running backs a lot. You got Robbie Anderson, their tight end. I just don't think there's enough volume there to trust that Curse would be good. I would sit him. Now look at the Jets. The Jets give up the 8th most points to wideouts. But with the suspension of Evans, here's what I would say in that game. That makes Deshaun Jackson, who has been kind of a disappointment this year. This is a good week to start Deshaun Jackson as a wide receiver too. As far as tight ends go, Bray, you need to start him. Jets give up the 7th most points to tight ends, and he's been remarkably consistent, so I'd start Bray. Austin Seferian-Jenkins, if you look at Tampa Bay, they actually shut down tight ends. Lavonte David does a great job of shutting tight ends down, so I would say that Austin Seferian-Jenkins is a low-end tight end too. I would probably sit him this week. As far as kickers go, I would sit both kickers. As far as defenses, you could play the Jets, are worth a look, but I would sit the Bucs. Vikings versus the Redskins. Well, quarterbacks. Kirk Cousins is a very good quarterback right now. He's playing the Vikings, who give up the 8th fewest points to quarterbacks. Now, he should get Crowder back this week, and hopefully Reed will play. Jordan Reed will play at tight end. Now, if you take a look at Kirk Cousins, he's what I would call this year, if you kind of take a look at the year he's having, he's been good. He's not great, but he's been good this year. He's got 13 touchdown passes, only 4 interceptions. He's averaging 268 yards per game, and he has a quarterback rating of 102, and so he's actually doing pretty well in football terms. In fantasy terms, against a tough matchup versus the Vikes, it'll be tough. So I would start him in this game if you need to, but I would expect moderate results against the Vikings. Now, Case Keenum is a game manager. He's not worth starting unless you're really, really desperate. Running backs in this game, Kelly has been awful. Last week, he scored 2 touchdowns that saved his day. Now he plays Minnesota, who gives up the 2nd fewest points to running back. Sit Kelly. I would start Chris Thompson. He's their best back. In fact, he's the best offensive player, and he's the best receiver at this point. They love to find ways to get Chris Thompson involved. I would start Chris Thompson. He's a must-start, certainly in PPR leagues. Now, in standard leagues, he lowers his value to about a running back 3 to 4 in standards. Jerick McKinnon, the Vikings running back. You look at the last 3 games, I should say 3 out of the last 4 games, he's had over 20 points per game. He's been really good. So even when Murray runs well, so what's going to happen? Murray had that one huge game. A lot of people felt like, okay, Murray will become the lead back. He'll get the carries on the first and second down. Jerick McKinnon will come on third down, passing downs. Well, it really doesn't matter how this plays out right now at this point. Here's why. McKinnon stays so involved. He's a great pass catching back. In fact, he's had 20 catches the last 4 games. So no matter who gets it, no matter who gets the carries, let's say Latavius Murray starts out, he runs the ball well. It's still going to see I think you're going to see a heavy dose of Jerick McKinnon also in this game. Look at Latavius Murray. Should you start him? Is he worth a look? Well, Redskins give up the 14th fewest points to backs. Murray's had one good game this year. He's inconsistent. And with how quality and how well McKinnon's playing, I would say Murray is a sit this week. As far as wideouts go, you got Crowder, had one good game. Was that a sign that he's going to get back on track? It could be. The problem with this week is you see Xavier Rhodes. Xavier Rhodes, a shutdown corner. Minnesota's great on defense. He's also questionable because he's banged up, and so I would sit Crowder. You look at Josh Dotson. He's improving, but he's still only averaging 1.5 catches per game, and so he's just not quite there yet. He's showing more and more potential, but he hasn't arrived as a consistent play. As far as Minnesota receivers go, you got Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs. Now, Stephon Diggs faces Washington's defense. It gives up the 6 fewest points to wideouts, and he will most likely be lined up against Josh Norman, who's been playing very well. I would probably sit Diggs, although I would consider starting Adam Thielen in this game, and I would say he starts at about a wide receiver 2 or 3. He shouldn't have to line up against Norman. That should be Diggs. And he's playing really well in PPR leagues. In fact, in PPR leagues, Adam has averaged over 16 points per game. In standard leagues, I would say he falls into what I would say a wide receiver 3 area. As far as tight ends go, Washington gives up the 3rd most points at tight end. You got to start Kyle Rudolph in this game. That's a great start. And Vernon Davis and Jordan Reed are both questionable, so watch the injury reports, and here's what I would say you should do with it. If Jordan Reed starts, you need to start him in this game. I would sit Vernon Davis. But if Reed can't go, then I would start Vernon Davis. Vernon Davis has a quality start last week, filling in. He had 6 catches for 72 yards. As far as kickers go, Kaya Forbath has had a great 3-week stretch in a row where he's just kicking the lights out of the ball, putting up huge points, and the Redskins give up a lot of points to kickers, so I'd start him. I would sit Nick Rose. As far as defenses go, I would start Minnesota. I would say Washington is a defense you could start. They're kind of middle of the pack. May want to look elsewhere, but if you're desperate, Washington's not a bad play. How about the Jaguars versus the Chargers? Well, I would sit Phillip Rivers. Right now, the Jaguars give up the fewest points to quarterbacks. Their defense is just playing phenomenal. In fact, going into last weekend, they were on pace to break the Chicago Bears' 1985 mark of 72 sacks. They're on pace for 75 sacks. They've put a ton of pressure on the quarterback. They're playing great. Just sit Phillip Rivers. Yep, could be a fluke. He may come out surprise. He may buck the trends. He may go against the statistics. But the bottom line is, if you play him this weekend, probably not a good play. Blake Bortles. Now, they play the Chargers this week. Chargers get the 12 fewest points to quarterbacks. Would you start Blake Bortles? Well, here's what I would say. If you look at the Jaguars, they're going to win one of 2 ways. They're going to play defense. They're going to run the ball really well. And Leonard Fournette's going to be back this week. And so I think there's going to be a heavy dose of defense, run the ball. And that gets very little value for Blake. I would sit him. As far as running backs go, Melvin Gordon, I would start him. Now, the Jags give the 9th fewest points to running backs. But in this is a case where Melvin Gordon is the #1 guy and volume wins out. He's going to get the carries. He's going to get the touches, so I would play him. You certainly can't sit a guy like him. And Fournette is a start. This guy's a stud. He has a great matchup. The Chargers give up the 8th most points to running back, so you need to start him. As far as wideouts go, I would sit all Chargers wideouts except Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen's the #1 guy there. He would fall into what I call wide receiver 3. And in PPR leagues, he could be bumped down to maybe wide receiver 2. He has a little more value there. Marquez Lee for the Jaguars is what I would say is a wide receiver 3. He has more value in PPR. You could play him as a wideout 3. As far as tight ends go, I would start Hunter Henry, and I would sit all Jags tight ends. As far as kickers go, Josh Lambo is a good start. I would sit Nick Novak. You need to start the Jags defense. And the Chargers actually worth a start against Blake and the Jags. What about the Texans and the Rams? Let's look at the quarterbacks. Well, the Rams are playing better and better, so I would sit Savage. Rams are looking pretty good at this point. You need to start Jared Goff. He had a great matchup. Now, last week he played Houston, who gives the 2nd most points to quarterbacks. So Jared Goff is playing Houston. Houston started the year. They looked okay on defense, but they're really struggling, like I said. 2nd most points to quarterbacks. Last week, Houston against Brissett. Brissett had 300 yards, 2 TD passes. Then you look at Goff last week. Last week, Goff had 300 yards, 4 TDs. He's trending. He's looking good. I think this is going to be a huge game for Jared Goff, so I would start Jared Goff in this game. As far as running backs go, you need to start Gurley. Now, Houston does give up the fewest points to running backs. So that could be an issue for Todd Gurley. But if you take a look at Goff in that offense, they move the ball. They're getting opportunities. His yards carry may dip, but I still think that Gurley's the guy that you can't avoid. Up to this point, he's been a TD machine. He's got 10 touchdowns so far this year. Lamar Miller in this game is a guy that actually need to play. You look at the Rams give the third most points to running backs, so I would definitely play Lamar Miller in that one. And I think what's probably going to happen is the Texans are going to want to slow this game down. They're not going to want to get in a shootout, especially without Deshaun Watson there. And so in order to avoid a shootout and take pressure off of Savage, I say a heavy dose of Miller and Foreman at running back to do that. So I would start Miller. As far as the wideouts go, Hopkins, you need to start him. Start him as a wide receiver too. Now last week he had a decent week, but that was against a bad Indy defense. So the Rams are tough to wideouts. He's still the number one guy in that offense, so I would start him. If you look at the Texans, they're not afraid to force feed him targets, so I still think Hopkins you need to start as kind of wide receiver too. I would sit Fuller this week. It's unfortunate. The guy was having a huge year. What happened to Sean Watson? A heartbreak for not only Watson, but for Fuller. Houston gives up the 9th most points to wideouts, so I would start Woods. If you look at 5 last 6 games, he's been very good. He's had double-digit points in those games. He's really the safest wideout of those 3 wideouts there. If you look, Cooper Kupp, Watkins, and Woods. Woods is the guy that I would start. How about Watkins? He's a guy, well, he scares me. Now, last week he did have a 67-yard TD, but it was the only catch that he had. In fact, if you take a look at him, he's trending downward. He's trending in the wrong direction. He's had 6 catches in the last 5 games. He's become a non-factor in that offense. You look at Cooper Kupp, he's a guy that you could start. Well, I like Cooper Kupp. I think he's going to be a quality wideout in this league. I think his next year is his year, though. I won't start him this week. As far as tight ends go, CJ should be back this week for Houston. If he does return, you need to start him. He's a quality tight end. And Tyler Higbee is a guy that you could start for the Rams, but he's a kind of a deep play, not a great play. As far as kickers go, I'd start Greg Zuerlein. I would sit Houston's kicker. As far as defenses go, start the Rams, sit the Texans. How about the Cowboys versus the Falcons? Well, Dak Prescott right now is playing great. He's a must start. Now, Matt Ryan, I would start him against Dallas, who gives up the 12th most points to quarterbacks. In this game, I think it could be a shootout, like I said, so they'll be forced to throw the ball. As far as running backs go, Dallas' offensive line is great. They're the best in the league. Now, obviously, if Ezekiel Elliott ends up winning or if he ends up delaying his suspension, you need to start him. But if he doesn't, start Alfred Morris as a running back too. Atlanta gives the 10th most points to backs. You look at that offensive line, Morris could be a huge play for you. Devontae Freeman's questionable, but if he starts, you need to start him. He's a good play. If he sits, start Coleman. Coleman could be a huge pick this week. Could be a sneaky pick for you out there. As far as wideouts go, you can start Julio Jones. For those Julio fans last week, he dropped a touchdown pass in the end zone. It was right there. Heartbreaking, especially if that's what cost you your game. But besides that, he's still a wide receiver that you need to start week in and week out. And Sanu. Sanu's a guy who's been targeted 20 times the last 3 weeks. He's getting more involved in the offense. You could start him as a wide receiver. He falls in kind of a wide receiver 3 or 4 category this week. You look at Dallas. Dallas gives up the 6 most points to wideouts. What about Des Bryant in this game? Well, one, he's questionable. Hurt his ankle, so he's questionable for this week. If he does play, I would start him as a wide receiver 2 or 3. Atlanta actually gives up the 9th fewest points to wideouts. He's not a great play. I would sit Williams. Now, Williams had a big game last week, blew up. But if you look at the rest of the year, he's been very quiet. He only holds value if Des Bryant's out. If Des Bryant's plays, I would sit Williams. Cole Beasley, yes, he has 4 TDs on the year, but he's never had over 24 yards in a game, so I would sit Cole Beasley. As far as tight ends go, I would sit Witten. You can see age is catching up to him, and Atlanta's very good against tight ends. I would sit Hooper. I would start Bryansworth to start at kicker, and so is Nugent. I would start him at kicker. Both defenses I would sit in this game. San Francisco versus the Giants. Well, you look at Eli Manning, the Giants have fall upon hard times. But I think Eli Manning is actually a good start this week, a 1-week start. He's not something you're going to roll with in the end for a 1-week plug if you need to. He's got Shepard back right now, and Evan Ingram has turned into a very good tight end. Evan Ingram has got Gronk-like skills. He's a guy that if you're in a keeper league or in a dynasty league, you need to pick this guy up. He's really good. Now he plays San Francisco, Eli does, and San Francisco gives up the 4th most points to quarterbacks, the 4th most once again. And so he's a guy that you could roll with this week. As far as San Francisco, I would sit Beathard. Jimmy Garoppolo's going to take over, but it sounds to me like he's not going to take over the offense after the bye week. I'll give him a few weeks to learn that offense, learn the playbooks, work on some things in practice. So it's going to be Beathard this week. He's got 2 TD passes in 4 games. No Pierre Garçon. Sit him in that game. That's a disaster. As far as running backs go, Hyde is a start. He's been used increasingly in the passing games. Carlos Hyde is a guy you need to play. And I think he's going to have greater value going into games like this because I imagine, like other running backs I've commented on earlier in the video, is I would imagine San Francisco is going to want to take pressure off their quarterback, and they're going to do that by trying to run the ball. You'll see a heavy dose of Hyde. Orleans Darkwa is a guy that you need to start this week. He plays San Francisco. He gives up the most points to running backs, and right now he's running really well. He's got a 4.4 yards per carry. This is a very good matchup for Orleans Darkwa. Start him this week. As far as wide receivers go, I would start Shepard last week. He came back, played for the first time after injuring his ankle, had 5 catches for 70 yards. This is another good matchup for him here. And I would sit all wide receivers for San Francisco. We take a look at that. About the only one there, if you really had to roll somebody, go with Goodwin, but he's really hit or miss. He's a wide receiver 4. I probably wouldn't roll with him. As far as tight ends go, start Evan Ingram. This kid has got so much potential. He's had a touchdown 3 weeks in a row. He's one of the few weapons Eli has. And I would sit George Kittle, at least until Jimmy Garoppolo takes over. As far as kickers go, I would sit both kickers. As far as defenses, I would sit San Francisco. And you can start the Giants if you're looking for a deep sleeper pick. You got the Broncos versus the Patriots. As far as quarterbacks go, sit Brock Osweiler. Yes, I know that New England gives up the most points to quarterback, but if you look at the last 4 games, that defense is improving greatly. Bill Belichick has figured it out. He always does. Come on, didn't we all know he was going to do that? I know they struggled, but I just kept waiting for them to figure it out, and sure enough, they have. That defense has gotten better. And so if you have to start Brock Osweiler, you could, but he sits in the 20s in terms of where his ranking for quarterbacks go, and that's very generous. Start Tom Brady. He's Tom Brady. Nothing to talk about there. As far as running backs go, well, Denver's fallen into a real ugly situation at this point. They really have 3 running backs that are sharing it. Booker has cracked in there. He's getting carries and looks, especially in the passing game, and he's running effectively. And so now you get Anderson, Charles, and Booker. That makes a scary situation not knowing you could trust. Right now, Anderson is still the lead back, but barely. I want to stay away from any one of those running backs at this point. If you had to go with one, I would still go with Anderson, but it's a running back by committee, as they say. Now, to make matters worse in this running back by committee, they're playing a decent, improving defense there in New England. Now you look at Denver. Now Denver is tough against running backs. They give up the 3rd fewest points to running backs. They were number 1 going to last week. They blew up. They had a huge week. Philadelphia had a huge week against them. And so, is there any New England running backs that have value? Well, White has some PPR value, but I would sit Mike Gillislee and Lewis this week going against the Broncos. As far as wideouts go in this game, Denver gives up the 4th fewest points to wideouts. I would start Cook as a wide receiver 2. You can't sit him, but you can't expect him to have wide receiver 1 numbers. Hogan in this game is doubtful. It's a tough matchup, so I would sit him. Now, if you look at New England gives up the 3rd most points to wideouts. So this week, it's a good start for Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders. Last week, Demaryius Thomas actually had a decent game. I think Emmanuel Sanders will probably get back on the board with a decent game in this one here. As far as tight ends go, you always start Gronkowski. Obviously, every week you need to play him. I would sit all Denver tight ends. I would start Gostkowski. I would sit McManus. I would start New England's defense. And I would actually sit Denver's this week. Start New England defense, sit Denver. And that brings us to the Panthers versus the Dolphins. Look at quarterback play in here. Well, Cam is a fair play in this game. Not great. Miami's defense is good against the pass. He has no Kelvin Benjamin now, and so there's a lot of question marks. What's really saving Cam Newton in terms of fantasy football is his legs. But he's a guy, because of his legs, because of his athleticism, you could play. Not a great quarterback play, but he's out there. Now you look at Carolina. Carolina gives up the 7th fewest points to quarterbacks. Now you look at last week, Jay Cutler had a huge week, 300 yards, 3 TDs, but that was against the Raiders. Now he's coming back and he's playing Carolina as a guy that you could start. Well, he does have Parker back. He's got Williams and Drake at running back, and they're both good pass-catching running backs. And so, if you take a look at the Panthers, well, they're really good against quarterbacks, but if you take a look at kind of where they've kind of built those numbers, they've shut down some below average quarterbacks. Some of the better quarterbacks that have played them actually fared well. And so when you look at Jay Cutler, he's not a bad play this week. He's a fair play. You look at running backs in this game, I would sit Stewart. Poor veteran struggling this year. He's been brutal. Last week he lost 2 fumbles. You look at McCaffrey. He came in. Actually, McCaffrey had a good game, so I would sit Stewart. I would consider starting McCaffrey. He had a nice performance, running the ball. But he's really, at this point, McCaffrey's still a lot of question marks. He's had 1 good game running the ball. His value really is in the passing game. He's got a huge PPR value. He's not dependable on standards yet, so he sits as kind of the running back 2 or 3. So I would sit Stewart. You could start McCaffrey. Now, if you look at the Panthers, they get the 4th fewest points to back. So I would start Drake. He looked good at running back, but he's a running back 3 at this point. As far as wideouts go, Funchess looked good as the team's a 1-1 guy. He had 5 catches, 86 yards on 7 targets. But Miami's tough against wideouts, giving up the 10th fewest points. So you could start Devin Funchess, but I would say that he's going to fall into a wide receiver to 2 or 3. I would start Parker. When healthy, he's looked very good. He's the most talented wide receiver on that team. And then Jarvis Landry, do you start? Do you sit him? Well, he's had 4 TDs on the year, but his yardage totals have been very, very low. He's valuable in PPR leagues, and understand that he's really touchdown dependent at this point. He's a wide receiver 3 or 4. As far as tight ends go, I would sit both Thomas and Dixon. Neither are good starts at this point. As far as kickers go, I would start Gano, I'd sit Parquet. As far as defenses go, I'd start Carolina, and I would sit Miami. So those are some of the things for you to consider. That's a lot of information. Sorry. If you have specific questions, go ahead and tell us on the bottom. We'd love to answer them for you. Thanks for joining us today at the FFP. God bless.